Brought to you by Charity Mobile. Switch to the phone company that supports your beliefs. All plans start under $50 before taxes and surcharges. Use promo code TRADITION at CharityMobile.com for a special offer. We usually talk about James Martin and the kind of nonsense he likes to promote in the month of June because the secular world has designated June to be its sort of secular feast season of celebration of the first deadly sin. Kind of an anti-Lent if you think about it at all. And James Martin is a full-throated supporter in all of those secular efforts, going so far as to say that the church has consistently interpreted the sin of those two cities that God destroyed in the Old Testament for the sins that crowd to heaven for justice. He has said the magisterium has got it wrong on those sins and that they really have been teaching the wrong thing and hurting a lot of people in this process. That yes, the spotless bride of Christ has caused great grave harm to people. He has said that St. Paul in the New Testament is also wrong on this issue, on that sin. We're talking here about the sins of two cities in particular in the Old Testament. And as you might notice by the way I'm saying this, our hosts don't like you even saying the names of those cities. Found that one out the hard way. It gets pretty ugly. But we're going to talk about the story anyway. We just have to be wise as a serpent, but as, gentle as a dove when we do it. So let's go to James Martin himself, because you have no reason to just take my word for it that he is actually just utterly gone off the deep end with this. Posted this to X. Anyone preparing homilies for this weekend, so he's telling this to priests, will notice that the first reading is Abraham's bargaining with God to prevent God's wrath against those two cities. Here is a distinguished Old Testament scholar on what the sins of those cities really were. And as you might guess, the sins he's talking about, what they really were, of course, the sin of inhospitality towards, but he's wrapped it up in the political topic du jour of our time in a brazen act. And it's an inhospitality, a hard word to say for some reason. My wife was laughing at me yesterday when I was telling her this. Inhospitality towards migrants. I'm not even kidding. That is the sin of those two cities in the Old Testament, according to this so-called distinguished scholar. And the article he posted, or that he posted a link to on X, comes from Outreach Catholic, his own organization that he started to do activism on making the church repent of being wrong in his eyes on that sin and of treatment of people. This distinguished scholar is, of course, Richard J. Clifford, S.J. Of course, it's an F.J. It's always a Jesuit. Is the story of those two cities about the sin that James Martin has an unhealthy interest in for a priest? Of course, he says no. And he goes over and how scripture is being misused for all of these things and causing grave harm on people and families. He even goes over the dictionary definition of that sin that is based off the name of one of those cities, that name. And he says how it's dangerous to actually define these things as associated with that sin or at least with that city, because that's not the real sin. And then he goes over some context of the story, which is fine. And we go down here to the avoiding misinterpretations part. Buckle up, folks. We're heading into deep heresy territory. Quote, Genesis chapter 19, verses 1 to 11 has given rise to misinterpretation of the entire story. The encounter of two angelic visitors with Lot and the citizens of the city. Though Lot is not a full citizen of the doomed city, according to chapter 19, verse 9, neither he nor his family behave righteously, for they accept only grudgingly the angel's directives meant to save them. Moreover, Lot's reception of the angelic visitors suffers in comparison with Abraham's reception of the Lord. Abraham rushes to serve them an extravagant meal and involves his wife and servants, whereas Lot welcomes them alone with what seems to be an ordinary meal. After the meal in Lot's house, quote, the men of that city, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house and called to Lot to bring his two guests into the town square to be large-scale forced upon, Genesis chapter 19, verses 4 to 5. Conscious to a foolish extreme of his role as host, Lot offers the group a shocking counteroffer. And then he quotes scripture where he's offering his daughters instead. The group scorns his proposal and moves in closer to break down the door. Given our interest not to allow the terms of the name of the city and the sin associated with it to take over our interpretation, it is important to note that the Lot's offer to surrender his two daughters to the group's lust implicitly reveals his own take on what the men of that city really intended. In Lot's eyes, the men of that city were not intent on James Martin type forced activities specifically, but rather on humiliating Lot, whom they despised as an immigrant and his two guests. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the sin of those two cities from the Old Testament, that sin that James Martin has got an unhealthy interest in for a priest to the point where it's warped his thinking, has been brought into the immigration debate now as a warning to America that if we continue on the path of enforcing laws the church has always said are just and allowing Caesar to do what is within his ethical realm, we will suffer the same fate as those cities. Recent accounts of warfare make clear that the systematic use of marital type activities on non-combatants is an all too common means of demoralizing and defeating enemies. Lot's words seem to indicate he is referring to that very practice. Lot's two guests rescue him by pulling him back into the house and shutting the door. The guests rescue the host. There's another little immigration lesson there. When the messengers tell Lot to lead his sons-in-law out of the doomed city, they laugh off his warnings. The passage uses the same Hebrew verb that describes Abraham and Sarah expressing delight at the prospect of a son. Even Lot, along with his two daughters, lingered, and the messengers had to seize them and lead them by hand out of the city. Once outside the city, Lot delays leaving for the safety of the hills using an excuse so foolish that it must be a humorous put down of Lot. He asks the messenger's permission to go to a little town, Zoar. Does Lot think that a small town would escape God's notice? The silly excuse seems to echo the lighthearted interplay between Sarah and the Lord in Abraham's tent. In other words, Lot was not taking the warnings about treating immigrants properly seriously. Let's go down to where they really hammer this home. It's not apparently a warning against that sin that James Martin has an unhealthy interest in for a priest. There is one last reference in Abraham 19:27. Quote, as he looked down towards those cities and the whole region of the plain, he saw smoke over the land rising like the smoke from a kiln. What was he thinking as he looked? We are not told, just as we are not told what Abraham was thinking in chapter 22 when he walked with Isaac toward the mountain to sacrifice him. Abraham's silence in both images is a reminder that the Bible leaves much unsaid, inviting the reader to imagine the thoughts of the character. And this is exactly why you need magisterial authority. And he is coming now against the consistent magisterial teachings of the church on this entire subject. The final stroke of Lot's story comes at 1930 to 38, when Lot's two daughters, whose husbands were apparently ended in this destruction, attempted to beget children through unnatural unions with their father. The acts will be revenge on their father for exposing them to the mob. Getting him drunk, they lie with him on successive nights. The first was Moab, the ancestor of the Moabites, and the second was Ben-Ami, the ancestor of the Ammonites. Again, it can hardly escape the reader's notice that the daughter's immoral and aggressive actions contrast totally with the faith and obedience of Abraham and Sarah. In conclusion, what the two did the attempt on the two angelic servants is certainly not a warning against the James Martin sin, and all attempts to interpret the narrative in that direction seriously misread the story. Rather, the story gives us a portrait of Abraham and his wife as they were, both in their own actions and in contrast to Abraham's nephew Lot. It displays Abraham's ability to bring God's blessings to the nations, offer hospitality to strangers, care for his family, and live trustingly by God's promise. And that right there is your arch heretic priest. I would really like to see that guy's web browser history personally. But that having been said, note that what they're doing with this article, that James Martin is spreading the article to get priests to use it as a teaching tool. To essentially say, no. Those cities in the Old Testament weren't destroyed because of unnatural activities that cry out to heaven for justice. It was because they didn't welcome the stranger. They were inhospitable to migrants. Ladies and gentlemen, that is where we are with James Martin. And he, while others get silenced, are allowed to continue to preach his errors. Now, of course, there are plenty of responses out there. I like this one here from Tradition in Action. The sin of that city was inhospitality, a response to this lie, written by Gary L. Morella. And he goes down. He said, a public challenge. He was challenged on this by a psychologist, and he's responding to them. He said, I would ask this psychologist to please give us the exact references in the Summa Theologica where Thomas Aquinas made the statements about the James Martin sin being natural, as the kindest thing that Aquinas has to say about it is that it is the unnatural vice. It should not be required to formally refute such outrageous, scandalous statements, but because of the confusion spawned by the dissident theologians, like Mr. Clifford there, who'd create their own heretical magisterium co-equal with that of Holy Mother Church, a response is in order. I will let St. Thomas Aquinas respond directly through his own words in the Summa. The clarity is unmistakable. First, the natural law will be addressed, then the James Martin sin. And now he's quoting Thomas Aquinas directly. Since, however, good has the nature of an end, and evil the nature of a contrary, hence it is that all those things to which man has a natural inclination are naturally apprehended by reason as being good, and consequently as objects of pursuit, and their contraries are as evil and objects of avoidance. Because in man there is, first of all, an inclination to good in accordance with the nature which he has in common with all substances, inasmuch as every substance seeks the preservation of its own being, according to its nature. And by reason of this inclination, whatever is a means of preserving human life and of warding off its obstacles belongs to the natural law. Secondly, there is in man an inclination to things that pertain to him more especially, according to that nature which he has in common with other animals. And in virtue of this inclination, those things are said to belong to the natural law, which nature has taught to all animals, such as activity suited to the married state, education of offspring, and so forth. Thus, man has a natural inclination to know the truth about God and to live in society. And in this respect, whatever pertains to this inclination belongs to the natural law. For it has been stated that to the natural law belongs everything to which a man is inclined, according to his nature. Wherefore, since the rational soul is the proper form of man, there is in every man a natural inclination to act according to reason, and this is to act according to virtue. Temperance is about the natural concupiscences of food, drink, and matters of the flesh, which are indeed ordained to the natural common good, just as other matters of law are ordained to the moral common good. By human nature, we may mean either that which is proper to man, and in this sense, as all sins, as being against reason, are also against nature, as Damascene states with a citation to Damascene. We may mean that nature, which is common to man and other animals, in this case, certain special sins are said to be against nature. Thus, contrary to the natural use of the flesh, which is natural to all animals, is attraction to inclinations towards the same as yourself, which has received the special name of the unnatural crime. Consequently, we must say that the natural law, as to general principles, is the same for all, both as to rectitude and to knowledge. As in man, reason rules and commands the other powers. So the natural inclinations belong to the other powers, must needs be directed towards the reason. The natural law dates from the creation of the rational creature. It does not vary according to time, but remains unchangeable. The natural law was perverted in the hearts of some men, as to certain matters, so that they esteemed those things good which are naturally evil. And it goes on to actually specifically talk about the sin in question. It cites Augustine. Remember, Aquinas' big project was to build on the work of Augustine, but to go back and in so doing to essentially baptize the work of Aristotle. And that's why he is excessive or extensively quoting him here. Now, I'm going to give you another kind of take on this. The priest, in a way, is correct. In a way. Obviously, it is inhospitable to your guests if you attempt to use force to engage in unnatural vices with them against their will. That is pretty clearly an act of inhospitality. However, that is not the chief sin of those cities. It is that they perverted the use of reason and the use of those natural inclinations. twisted them into something not just unnatural, but to a diabolical mockery. Exorcists who speak on this consistently, not just Father Ripperger, whom I respect, but many others, have said that according to all their experience doing exorcisms, the demons leave the room when those activities start up. It's even repulsive to them. They will happily lead people to those sins because what it does to your soul, but they don't want to be there when you're doing it. Should be food for thought, but it is not, of course. So yes, there is certainly an inhospitality angle to that sin. You're being inhospitable to God. You're driving out grace. 2 of the visitors of the 3 were angels, and the other was the Lord himself. James Martin has been engaged in a project to upend church teaching on this for practically his whole public career. Once Francis came to the forefront and he was able to publicly say these things without repercussions. Now, here we are, almost 3 months now under a new pope, and he only briefly reined it in. And you could chalk that up more to how periodically James Martin just doesn't say much, except reposting things on X and taking care of affairs at America Magazine and at Outreach. And then he, once in a while, will just drop this kind of a news story on the church. And he will get silenced. There's 0 chance he will get silenced. Priests like him are tolerated. But another story for you to compare and contrast this to. Many of you have been wondering what the fate of the FSSP are going to be under Leo. One of the reasons people wonder this is because under Francis, they received a literally handwritten promise from Francis, written on essentially a notepad or a napkin, promising them that they will be able to say the traditional Mass according to the 1962 liturgical books in perpetuity, meaning basically forever. However, this act of his, and I have no reason to doubt that the FSSP who posted this on their own website say that what they're telling is the truth, that they were given such a promise. I'm not going to call them liars. But you will never find this in the official depository of apostolic acts on the Vatican's website. It's not listed under Francis's activities. Yes, they have a handwritten thing with his signature on it. How binding is that going to be? We shall see. But people wonder what's going to happen under Leo with the FSSP. And they have good reasons to wonder about this. We saw in Detroit and we saw in Virginia and some other places where suddenly, well, not Virginia, but Charlotte and a few other places in Detroit, bishops coming out of the woodwork to speed up their crushing of the traditional Latin Mass in their dioceses. They, without hesitation, were implementing Traditionis Custodes, citing that their predecessors, because these were typically new bishops to a person who did this, that their predecessors had asked for a delay of implementation on Traditionis Custodes from the Vatican while they came up with a plan on how to do it properly, and the Vatican granted this to them. This happened a few times. And they all say that their permissions expired, and so they just implemented these things. Now, they didn't think to submit another request to Rome, CCing the Holy Father on it, because there's the new Pope. And maybe they can get a permission. They didn't think to do that. And many people wonder about the fate of the FSSP. Every year, they get an apostolic visitation, which is a little unusual. Clearly, Rome is wanting to keep eyes on them to make sure that they offer the traditional Mass and the preconciliar sacraments, but they aren't training the priests to be troublemakers, essentially, is what it looks like as an outside observer who hears a little bit. I'm going to give you an example of why they do this. Every year, during the spring, your bishop will offer a chrism Mass. And no priest is required to say it with him, but the bishop will invite all the priests of the diocese to go to the cathedral and celebrate, meaning celebrate with him, the Novus Ordo Mass for the Chrism Mass. This has been a sticking point with the FSSP for 30 years because they are dedicated to saying the traditional Mass exclusively. There are FSSP priests who have publicly offered the new Mass, and they do it on their own accord. But they have a promise that they will never be forced to say it and never be facing negative consequences for it. So far from Rome, they've never faced negative consequences, but that has not been the case in most places. And so I'm going to show you a story here of what happens. Gloria TV posted this. Headline: Public prayer, fasting, and online protest against crackdown of a flourishing Roman apostolate. And I'll go over this article in detail with you in just a moment. The FSSP in that diocese were invited to celebrate the Novus Ordo Mass at the Chrism Mass. They said no, as is their right, according to canon law and all the procedures protecting the FSSP. The bishop's response was to crush them in his diocese. For those wondering what's going to happen to the FSSP, it does sure seem like these days some bishops are feeling emboldened to act in ways that even Francis did not. We'll see. Time will tell. Here are the details. Quote, tensions have arisen over the decision of Bishop Francois Durand of Valence in the southeastern Drôme region of France to close the long-standing apostolate of the priestly fraternity of St. Peter, the FSSP. This apostolate was founded in September 1988. Catholics in Valence and Montpellier have started a strict fast and prayer vigil near the Church of Notre Dame in Valence. Some are sleeping in tents in the car park. Around 400 parish members signed an open letter on ledauphine.com, urging the bishop to reconsider. The masses and the entire apostolate, including 13 catechism groups, are set to end on September 1st. For those keeping track, that's about 6 weeks from now. The diocese justified the crackdown by claiming, quote, repeated disregard for diocesan guidance. However, the key point of contention has just been the FSSP's refusal to celebrate the Chrism Mass in the Novus Ordo. On the 15th of May, Bishop Durand had announced that the celebration of Sunday Mass in the Roman Rite, meaning the traditional Mass, would be entrusted to diocesan clergy, meaning the full implementation of Traditionis Custodes. All other sacraments will be abolished. That means that all other options for the traditional Mass will be abolished in that diocese. One priest from the priestly fraternity of St. Peter may continue to celebrate Mass once a week in the diocese. Once a week. In a second letter dated the 23rd of May, Bishop Durand had criticized pastoral initiatives of the FSSP lacking, quote, diocesan orientations. What that generally means is that they're teaching the Catholic faith the same way your great-grandparents learned the Catholic faith. Through the same kinds of catechetical studies, the same kinds of teaching that our ancestors would have seen as Catholic, as opposed to the new synodal spirit of Vatican II stuff going on. Much firmer than what we had in what happens in many dioceses now. That is what that means. It means that they are not going with the spirit of the times. They are teaching something that the local authorities in the Vatican, or at least in this case, in that diocese, find objectionable. So, when I tell you that men like James Martin and other equally horrendous priests are able to teach heresy publicly, and they get away with it, despite there being a new pope, they continue to get away with it, while bishops crush the FSSP, despite them having a papal signed guarantee of their protection. It's a sign of the times we live in. And one wonders if other bishops will follow suit. Short of the Vatican intervening and telling this bishop, no, you can't do that, will other dioceses and other bishops' conferences follow suit? I'm reminded of a story from the last couple of years. Down in Mexico, there was a seminary, the FSSP. I think it was an FSSP one. It was definitely a not an SSPX seminary. It had a good relationship with the bishop until it changed suddenly. And he tried to close the whole thing down. It took the laity organizing in that diocese to keep some presence open to the public for that seminary open. Very little is happening with this. A petition letter. I'm not a fan of petition letters. If you want to read it, it'll be on the show notes at returntotradition.org at the new Anthony Stine Substack. Links in the description box to those. Do not sign that petition unless you live in the diocese. This is clearly an open letter from the affected laity to that bishop. So respect their their efforts here, but read it if you want to. I'll have it in the show notes there for your consideration. But note that heretic priests like James Martin and others never, ever get punished. It's only those who uphold the same religion of our ancestors. They're the ones who get punished for doing things that are perfectly within their canonical rights, as in this case, not being forced to offer the Novus Ordo Missae. Curious what you think about this, so let me know in the comments. Philip asks, is this not the second time French bishops have used this excuse? Yes, that's happened in the last few years as well. The French bishops are the home of the per capita largest traditionalist movement in the entire church, meaning you have more, per number of French Catholics, you have more traditional mass offerings than anywhere else in the world. And the bishops there have opinions that range from mildly disinterested to the whole thing to openly hostile. So you may see more of this in France. I am very curious what you think about this, so let me know in the comments, please. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It absolutely does help. Sharing this on social media helps too. If you would please pray for everybody affected in that area, that would be greatly appreciated, including the bishops. We're not here to make you angry at them. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.